At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Doug. I sure appreciate it.
Well, and I'm excited. You reached out to me, and as we had a chance to, text back and forth, I found an email back and forth. I found that your approach and what you're doing is just really effective and can really make a difference in people's lives. What I'd love for you to do as we get started is kind of share with the audience who you are and what brought you to the point of doing what you're doing here and working with people.
Awesome. I'd love to do that. So, as we said, my name is Mark Wigginton. I'm based in Austin, Texas, and so we're having an interesting time zone challenge together this morning, this evening. I've had multiple phases in my life, and all those phases have kind of built on each other. And I think kind of the theme that has run through all those phases has been about self-discovery. So whether that was, when I was a young person, I lived in a kind of a lot of chaos, and I built that and brought that forward into my career. In my mid-30s, I went to rehab, and then I changed my career and became a licensed professional counselor, and I got a master's degree, and I worked in community mental health. I did that for about 7 years, and then I moved back into business. In that period of time of transition, that was like a 15-year window, and I had about 20 different jobs in that 15-year window of the time I worked in community mental health, and then came back into business. And then that led to kind of the last phase of my career, where back to back, I had some self-discovery, some real deep transformation. And I wound up in one job doing the same thing that used all my skills for the next 15 years. So back to back, 20 jobs in 15 years, then one job in 15 years. Left full-time work a couple of years ago so I could be a greater support to my parents. And then in 2023, I went through a period where my mother died, followed by my stepmother, followed by my father in 99 days in really quick succession.
Wow.
That led me to where I am today, this place of really kind of deep introspection and trying to figure out what everything was about in the past so that I can use it as I move forward into my next chapter.
Well, and it's interesting because, we talk about new phases in our lives, new chapters in our life. I like to talk about new beginnings, and you've been through a few chapters.
I have.
And I'd be curious, and if you don't want to be too transparent, I appreciate that. But so you talk about you had your one job in business, and then you went into rehab.
Yeah.
What was causing you to get into that situation, where I would assume you were a very successful businessman at the time? What happened?
Yeah, Doug, outwardly, I was really successful. I had kind of started my career. I was in a sales role and was very successful at that on the outside, but inside I was still pretty empty. I was still pretty hollow. Not to turn it into a drunkalog, but I had, again, I grew up in a really chaotic environment. My parents married really young. My mother had me at 18. She was single. She was married at 18. She had me at 19, and she was single by the time she was 20. So there was lots of movement, lots of juggling. So I kind of grew up in this real chaotic environment. And as a teen, like a lot of people, I experimented with alcohol, and I found that was something that helped calm me. That was something that helped me manage the chaos internally. And that just carried through. And it was a great coping tool until it wasn't. And when I was about 30, that was the place where I said, you know what, this isn't working anymore. It's not me. And, when I went to rehab, I had no intention of changing my career. I had no intention, and I came back out and I was like, this isn't what I really want to do, how I really want to spend my life. So I went back to school and got my degree and made the shift.
Okay. So it's really interesting how how deeply our childhood can affect us. And, as you say, for you, it was alcohol to try to just kind of wipe away all of those situations. And you were doing something that you were being successful at, but as you said, you were not happy. And when you went to rehab and as you went through that whole process, and I would assume that that was part of the inspiration for you going to psychology for a while,
Yeah.
what were some of your innate self-discoveries that you feel would be applicable to people who may be at the point right now where they're working hard, but they find that they're relying on alcohol or drugs or whatever
Yeah.
to compensate for something that occurred to them years previously that they've just not been able to deal with?
Yeah. Gosh, that's such an important question. And we can talk about this a couple of different ways. And I do a lot of work right now with men and dealing with men's mental health issues. So I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of men's mental health,
Okay.
even though it's probably applicable in both sides. And the bottom line is that, you know, at least, so I'm in the US, and in this culture, people of my generation and the boomers, we grew up a certain way with a certain image of what masculinity was, right? It was John Wayne and, Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, right? Or,
Right.
his character in The Shootist, where you're strong and you don't need anybody, and, you don't rely on anybody, and you don't talk about what's going on. Today, for today's generation, for our generation, it was John Wayne. For today's generation, it's John Wick. The same
Yes.
same kind of behavior, right? But yeah, I think that's really true for a lot of us. We outwardly perform, maybe without really taking care of ourselves, and that leads to this kind of double life where we are, to all appearances, we are out there and really making it happen in the world, but inside we still have feelings that are unresolved from childhood. um, I work with a lot of people who fall kind of under the category of highly sensitive persons. And I don't know if you talked about HSPs on your podcast, but it's this trait of characters that are really about how you process deeply. And a lot of that stuff comes from childhood. So, it's how deeply do you process? How do you respond to overstimulation? For me, responding to overstimulation was the alcohol to tone everything down, right? How do you deal with reacting emotionally? How do you deal with empathy, and how do you manage empathy? Those are some of the key skills. And how are you sensitive to kind of the subtleties? Well, those things all are powerful in helping people in business be aware, be present, know what's happening in the room, know what other people are feeling. But at the same time, if you're not managing it inside, it can become a real issue. And I think that's what happened to me in my journey, is that I had to manage my overstimulation to that chaos that I grew up in. And then that just carried forward into work. And I talked about having 20 jobs in 15 years. That was me continuing to recreate the chaos until I found a better way to cope, right? Until that
Really?
second phase, when I found a more effective coping skill, that allowed me to be grounded and use all the lessons of my past.
Well, and it's interesting you talk about those childhood or even teenager, whenever it happens, but those
Yeah,
imprints that just continually come up, the reactivity, the emotions that come up that are in most cases initially totally out of our control.
right.
I love this concept of free agency, of agency. And yet I sometimes think, you know what? For many people, that doesn't exist
Right.
because they are so controlled by those childhood experiences that have
Yeah.
imprinted in their subconscious minds that anytime anything happens, their response emotionally to whatever event comes up goes right back to that subconscious imprint or
Yeah. The
imprints in
five
plural.
the 5-year-old drives the bus, right?
Yeah,
The adult is out there in front, but it's like the Wizard of Oz. Who's the man behind the curtain, right? The 5-year-old, the unresolved stuff that's happened, it impacts how we interact with the world as adults.
well,
It's
and
really
and
true.
when you went into rehab, I mean, you talk about rehab, and I think, okay, I get that, but not having ever been there, um, do they really delve into those childhood things? Do they really delve into how to overcome that chaos that's controlling your lives as part of that, or is that a separate thing that one works with in addition to working with overcoming whatever addiction there happens to be?
See, all of the above. So, and I had an opportunity, kind of a unique opportunity to when I went to rehab. I went to a rehab in Canada that had a little bit of a different focus, right? So it focused more on the behaviors that drove what they talked about as the X factor, right? So they talked about the behaviors that drove why you made the decisions you did to use whatever it was you were using. And I was dealing with, in my group, it was just people with alcohol, drugs, sex, work, everything. There were spouses of people who had been before, who were trying to learn how to understand the dynamics of the relationship, being in a relationship with a person who had a dependence. So, there was a lot of deep introspective work and a lot of humbling work and group work. It's like if you've been to therapy and you go and you have a session with somebody and it's 45 minutes or 50 minutes and you kind of chat and you work your way through it. And then the last 5 minutes, you drop your little door, as you're about to leave, you drop the little bomb 5 minutes before you go. Well, you don't get away with that when you're locked away for 28 days.
Yeah.
You're doing, 16 hours of group work a day, or working in your journal or whatever your tools are. So it really is a chance for introspection. And it really jump-started me. Now, we can continue on in my story and we can talk about how, the process of recovery is not a straight line. And, I worked after I finished that, I worked with people who were, in mental health settings, who were in substance abuse treatment settings. And there came a period of time when I relapsed and wasn't able to reach out and went back into the business world. I chose to just say, listen, I can't, I'm not being honest with myself or with my clients. I need to turn and leave because I couldn't ask for help at that point. And I went back into the business world then.
Well, and then what finally got you back, if you are there now? What got you back? Because, you talk about something I think that's so important, that we think that we can change overnight. And, we
Yep.
go to therapy, we go to rehab, whatever that happens to be. I know that I worked, when I was working as a consultant for some businesses, I worked with the rehab center. And as we talked about it, I was very close to the owners. And as we talked about it, it was an interesting story that they would help someone, they would leave, and then they would come back. And so there's just that repeat that continues to go on. And I think to some degree, this gets into this whole concept of mindset, that at what point in time are you aware enough and in control enough, and your mind is conscious enough to recognize that when that trigger comes up to get you to go have a drink or whatever, that you're able to recognize that and just kind of push it away. But as you say, these are habits that we develop all over our lives, and breaking a habit is really tough. So how did you ultimately, so you went from working with people as a psychologist back to regular work, and as you say, even then you went back and fell back off the wagon. So
Right.
how did you, if you have, how have you ultimately gotten to the point, recognizing that I'm sure it always comes up for you, but how have you gotten to the point where you've been really able to truly overcome that and recognize that, always an alcoholic, but no longer partaking?
Yeah. So a long question or a long answer too.
I'm sorry.
A long answer. No,
I do that.
A long answer. It's going to be a long answer to that question because it encompasses so many different things. So, first off, going back to the phase of, working with people who struggled, I one of the jobs that I had during that phase is I worked in the county jail and a rehab center that was in the jail. So these are people who have, had risks, and, a substance abuse issue was a core to why they committed their crime. And so part of their journey through the criminal justice system included them having the opportunity to do this. So, I was deeply involved in people who were struggling, and I would be there to help them understand the process of relapse, right? And the key was that when I relapsed, I wasn't able to offer myself that same grace. And that's something that happens a lot. People perform care, right, for other people without really feeling worthy of deserving that themselves. That's something that happens a lot in the mental health community. So I went back out, and then I created this crazy world where, I lived on the road. I was a consultant on the road, a trainer, sales consultant, management consultant. You just talk about consulting, that gig, right? And I was there all the time. And I created an environment where I didn't have boundaries. And so I had the freedom to go out and to drink and do whatever it was that I wanted to. But still, I had the lessons in the back of my mind, which set up this really powerful conflict, right? I lived this double life, because on the road, I was this kind of wild, crazy life of the party, lampshade on the head guy. And then I'd come home and I'd try to be balanced. And I lived that way for a really, really long time until I had a hard consequence. I mean, I found myself being the guy on the side of the road, doing the hokey pokey, like the people that I had dealt with, 8 years earlier. There was an 8-year journey of that transition for me. And even after that, and I found new ways to manage my anxiety, new ways to manage the overstimulation. I still struggled with alcohol, and every time I would drink, I would have that challenge. So I'm going to fast forward now through that story to the death of my parents, and that was in 2023, and that led me to this really deep introspection. I went back into therapy for the first time in a really long time. And one of the first things I learned as I worked with this therapist was about something that had evolved over time. And it was a model called harm reduction. And so the harm reduction model provides for a person who is struggling with abstinence to determine what their own goals are. To say, you know what? My life is working in these 5 areas. I can manage whatever my drug of choice is, whatever I'm deferring from. And just because I'm not able to stay 100% abstinent doesn't mean that I failed. It's not all black and white. It moves away from black and white, which, if you really look at the original message of the 12-step programs, if you go all the way back to the very beginning, it was do your best today, and if you screw up, start again tomorrow. Right? That was the original message of the 12-step programs. Well, that's what harm reduction does. And Doug, that gave me a new freedom, right? It gave me the freedom to make a decision without being bad if I'm not perfect.
Isn't
And
it?
That's what it.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? You mentioned the word grace, and I don't know where your theological beliefs are, but regardless of that, when we think of grace and giving ourselves grace or receiving grace, what's interesting is that we don't understand so often that, as you said, you changed your mindset about the fact that, hey, if you decided to have a drink, rather than that feeling that guilt of, okay, I've relapsed, that you look at it from, okay, I did that, really shouldn't have, but I did. And then giving yourself the grace to forgive yourself and to move forward the next day.
Yeah. And so this ties all the way back to the earlier question about perfectionism, right? And to the earlier question about, how were you performing so well in work and struggling inside? It's because I couldn't give myself that grace. And it took me until I was 63 years old to give myself that grace. And it's led to a whole new thing, because I can choose or not choose. And so I choose to not. I choose to be abstinent.
Well,
Today I'm abstinent, right? And if I'm tomorrow, if something happens, okay, then I start again, right? It's about being more present with myself and giving myself that freedom. And I think that's so important for men. I think in general, back to this, we've got to be strong. We have to be perfect. Guess what? Give yourself a little bit of grace and give yourself the ability to be a human and to make mistakes and recover from your mistakes. Every single day, you have the opportunity to choose again in every element of your life.
and I think what that does too, which I find fascinating, is we give ourselves some grace.
Yeah.
and recognize that, you know what, I can have a new beginning and I can have as many new beginnings as I need.
Right.
That do you find from your background in psychology, do you find that as someone moves away from that guilt and that perfectionism to recognizing that, hey, give myself a little grace and start a new beginning again, do you find that that mentality helps them to be strengthened in overcoming some of those issues?
Absolutely. I mean, giving yourself the freedom, getting off your back, giving yourself the freedom to move forward and to accept that none of us are perfect, right? Accept that it's okay that you're not perfect, I think is a really important key for anybody, to be able to move forward. I mean, I deal in my work right now, here in the States, there's so much going on with the government and all the people who are being let go and laid off. And because of something that happened in that later phase of my career, I wind up working with a lot of people who are caught up in that. And even they need to give grace on themselves that something that's not their fault, you know, they were laid off, they were fired, they got the Doge notice or they got the fork notice or whatever the things that are involved in for the people in the government sector, and they feel terrible guilt, or they may have been top performers all along and got promoted, and then they got a letter that said you're being let go because your performance is substandard, which wasn't true. So even then, half the time it's helping people on get through that, and I realize that it's not about them, and uncover what the strengths are that they have, that they've learned from that they can take forward into the next phase.
Well, when you talk about the word perfection, and I have looked at that word for so many years, and I look at it from the standpoint of imprints that have occurred early in childhood, particularly for people who are religious, and be therefore perfect. And yet, as I've really studied it, I've recognized that number one, that's not what it meant. We have an incorrect definition of what is used as the word perfect, when in fact you go to the original meaning used in the Hebrew was be complete, just be complete. And that
Right.
changes the whole sense of guilt to one of, oh, okay, I just need to work on certain things. But what I find fascinating here in Thailand, I've asked some people, so tell me a little bit about the word perfection. And they say, we don't even have that word in our language. We don't even have it. And so it's interesting where you have the English speaking people that have that. And I'm sure in other countries where they still have that concept of perfection, and how that can so deeply affect a person's mentality and their whole emotional stability.
You talked in that interview that you did a few months ago with Marcos about your experience with that you're learning about Buddhism while you're
Yeah.
there. Is that tied to this sense of self-acceptance and completeness and lack of perfection? Is that what you're finding in Thailand?
I think so, and I look at it from the perspective of doing, and again, I focus on this to some degree, that there's always this constant comment that you need to do, you need to do, you need to do so that you can become. And I've always looked at it from a little different perspective, and it's like, you know what, as you become, you will naturally do.
Right.
And so it's that reverse of recognizing that, hey, quit worrying about what you're doing or what you can't do and so forth. Just work on, as you have, that transformation of becoming. And as you do that, then naturally you will do. And so I think that, yes, here in Thailand with Buddhism, of course, his whole focus was that inner peace, that inner sense
Right.
of getting away from the struggling and so forth. And I find that that's true in many religions, in many
Right.
faiths, that really is the case if you look at it and if you get
Yeah.
honest with what's going on. So yeah, I think from that perspective, now, do they have issues here? Absolutely, because as I see
Yeah.
sometimes what they're doing, um, there's that whole issue that I don't even want to talk about, because in some ways they're so kind, they're so friendly, even though, their lives can be very difficult. But then again, many of them spend the day drinking. And so you have that concept of kindness and love, which I think is universal here. But at the same time, they're still dealing with those issues of boredom or whatever it happens to be, and
Yeah.
struggling, that cause them to go into that direction. And I'm not talking about everyone, but just where I
Right.
happen to live, it's very rural. And so I observe that a lot among the Thai workers.
And it's still about humanity.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, the human condition is striving to be perfect and not being successful. And so, we all have to find our way to cope and deal with it. I think regardless of our culture, regardless of our gender.
Well, and that's true. And allowing the ego, in fact, we talked about that this morning in another podcast, the fact that we can have a very positive ego, or we can have an ego that's affecting us negatively. And I know that, that's talked about in a number of books. But, as you look at that, do you find that part of the challenge that many of the men are experiencing, where they're working hard, they're being successful, but they're not really finding that sense of peace within themselves, that part of the issue is that ego of, I need to do this in order to be that, and I need to have this in order to be that? Do you find that that's the case? And if so, how do you help them to not eliminate an ego, because that's what I don't believe, but recognize that
Right.
a positive ego has us move forward in a very positive direction. A negative ego is the one that keeps controlling us and tells us if we do this or if we have this, we will be accepted.
Yeah. So that takes us back to rehab. And
Okay.
and it takes back to one of the lessons that I learned that stuck with me, and I've used consistently through my own life, and I share with other people. And what I learned there was kind of three parts of the ego. Okay, so I learned that there's a bully that we use to present ourselves. And again, maybe that's the person that's out there and outperforming. And then there's a scared child that's behind them, right? That's the 5-year-old that's kind of pulling the strings. And then there's a third part that's the identity, and that's the peacemaker between the bully and the scared child. And the deal is finding a way to integrate the bully and the scared child to allow your identity to shine through, to allow you to become who you really are, and who you're meant to be, kind of as this, I mean, if you want to say, as a spiritual person having a human experience. And again, that takes us back to acceptance.
Well, and that's so true. And you talk about rehab, you talk about therapy, and you are a psychologist. I mean, you have that background and training. And what I found is I've interviewed a number of psychologists, that one of the things that comes up is the approach. Now, you talked about the fact that when you went to Canada, their approach was not just, the 12-step program, but it was also getting into the real causation of what was
Right.
going on and what was motivating that. I would assume, in general, they probably have a greater success rate from that approach. And I know that as people are going to therapists, one of the things that we've talked about is they need to be aware, if they find that all of it is talk, 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 talk,
Yeah.
that they need to find a different therapist, because there are those good therapists out there, such as yourself, because I know you approached it that way, to where they get into, let's look at the real causation, what's going on here, and let's figure out those childhood imprints, those emotional imprints that are causing this behavior, and how you can literally understand and move those to the side so that now you can truly become who you want to become.
Yeah. So most of the work that I do right now is as a coach, and integrating the counseling background that I have, but being forward focused. And so it's exactly what you talked about. One of the key differences, I think, in my experience, have been having been a therapist, a counselor, and then moving forward to be a coach, is that a counselor helps you kind of process the stuff in the back, and a coach helps you focus on moving forward. It's much more action oriented, like you just said. So finding somebody, I think, that has the kind of that unique experience of having a strong foundation in counseling psychology, a key business, 30 years, almost 25 years in business following that, and then combining those things together into being an executive coach. Those are the things that enable me to work with clients and help them move into action. And I sneak things in, right? I sneak things in. Like, I'm not going to say, tell me about when you were 5, but one of the first exercises that anybody ever does when they work with me is, okay, sit down and look at every job you've ever had. That goes all the way to when you threw newspapers when you were 12 years old, right? And look and tell me in every single job, write down what was good, what sucked, and what I learned. And when you do that kind of an inventory, you start to uncover patterns. So I don't have to go, what were your patterns? I help them uncover in the business world what their patterns are. And guess what? Those patterns are going to be reflected in your life. And it helps uncover what you need to do to move forward to break that pattern. That's on the challenge side. It also uncovers what the strengths are that you're bringing forward into the next phase of your career.
Well, and that's great. One of the things that you and I talked about is the experience you had with your dad and your relationship with your father, and how that was such a journey for you and the impact that had. Would you mind sharing with the audience that story?
Sure. And there are multi phases to that story. I already mentioned that their marriage, my parents' marriage, didn't last very long. That, again, they were married when she was 18. She had me when she was 19. She was single by the time she was 20. So I met him when I was 10 for the first time. We saw each other a few times back and forth. After I went to rehab, it was brought up to me as something that I really needed to resolve. Again, back to the rehab story. So it was brought up as something that I really needed to resolve. And so I reached out to him.
Let me stop you. What did you need to resolve?
The impact of his absence in my life.
Okay.
And the impact that it had on me,
Okay.
it was one of the biggest challenges of the whole time, because they said, oh, like they would do psychodrama and you'd have to like role play this thing. I'm like, dude, I don't have anything to role play, and they're like, oh no. And, and we had to work through it. And I found an incident, and where I had seen him, and we worked through that. And so that lack of relationship, and I think that's true again for a lot of men, right? The lack of relationship, whether your father was physically absent or emotionally absent, is one of those key things that influences how we move forward. So, after I got out of rehab, I reached out to him, and he came down and visited, and he was actively drinking. And at this point, I wasn't. Right. At this point, I was fresh out of rehab. And so we weren't able to connect. And we met, and then we really kind of didn't see each other for a while. And then I went to school, I got my degree, I worked at the jail. And that's when I started to have this really transformative experience, because like I said, I was working in, an inpatient rehab inside the jail. So we'd have groups, we're all men. Really the first time I had ever been in a group of men that way. I've been in the military, but it's mixed gender. It's a very different thing. And every once in a while, these tough guys, covered with tattoos and, histories of problems and challenges would get real. And they might talk about their father and their relationship. But most importantly, I found that they talked about the lack of relationships they had with their sons and their nephews. And, I could relate to that, I could relate to the loss. So then I would work outside, as they say, inside the fence and outside the fence. So then I work outside the fence in the adolescent boot camp. And I'd go and have groups with young men who were the sons and nephews of the men inside the fence, who then would talk to me about their anger about the loss of relationships with their fathers and uncles. So the dads were talking about their grief over the loss of relationships with their sons and nephews. And the sons and nephews were talking about their anger about their relationships with their father. This really impacted me tremendously as I kind of worked through my own things. So this is in the snail mail days. And I wrote a letter to my father, and I said what I just said to you. And I wrote at the bottom, I'm one, if you're the other, let me know. And within a matter of a couple of weeks, snail mail. So within a matter of a couple of weeks, he knocked on my door. and said, I got your letter, let's talk. So, I'm 35, and that's kind of took us to the next level of our relationship. At that point, I was still in recovery. I was still working in the community. He wasn't. So we still kind of bounced back and forth off each other. And then as I went through my relapse journey and went back to drinking, we were able to find that as a common bond. And whether it was healthy or not, it was something that allowed us to move our relationship forward in that phase. So now fast forward through that period of time, we still kind of bounced off each other. I was still struggling with my double life as I went through this and trying to get healthy, but would be uncomfortable with who I became often when I was with him, because I would try to please him with, or to match him with the use. But so now let's fast forward to 2023 and going through this traumatic time. So I said the first thing that happened was that my mother died. And then following that, his second wife, my stepmother, died, and then he died in this 99-day window. And I have two half siblings and then a nephew that all live up there and were with him. And we had all kind of touched each other a little bit. It was like he was the hub and we were spokes, so we kind of touch each other, but it was really about Jack. And they called and asked me to go out there because he was really ill and it looked like it might be the end. And Doug, what happened, I went up there and Trudy was gone. His wife was gone. She already passed. He was in the hospital. So they they said, go stay at his house. Just go stay there. There's no TV. There's no nothing in there, but just go stay there instead of staying at a hotel. And I walked in and because they had already started with the loss of their mother, they'd gone through so many things at the house. And Jeff, my brother, hands me this box and he says, hey, this is the only thing we haven't gone through. This is the private photos. This is Jack's private photos. And it's the only thing we haven't gone through. Take some time and look through these things. And so I pick up and I open this box and it's really kind of the story of his life in these photos. And in the middle of this, there's a plastic bag. And I pick up the plastic bag and it's all photos and letters from me. And it's not just photos and letters from me from when we reestablished our relationship. It's somehow photos of me from the time, before we established our relationship, from the 0 to 30 phase. And it was just so impactful to uncover this and see that, at some level, he really kind of did pay attention and care. And it reframed so much of how I looked at my life and how I looked at our relationship. And again, this is literally days, weeks before he passed. And I was up there and we actually had a chance to talk about that and get to kind of a different level of reconciliation. And it's a big part of this journey, this transformational journey that I'm on since that season of grief, of losing those three very important people. And it just showed me something really different. I mean, it just showed me, it helped me understand that he was doing the best he could with the resources that he had, just like I had been in my life, doing the best I could with the resources I had. Sorry, that was a long answer, but.
Yeah, but that was a wonderful answer, and I appreciate your transparency. What comes to my mind as you talk about that is, particularly in the United States, you hear all of these statistics about children that grow up without a father.
Yeah.
And, recognizing the damage that can occur. But one of the points I think you make for many who have gone through divorces, because, it's upwards of 50%. And,
Yep.
and there's obvious reasons for that, some valid, some not. But the importance, I guess what I'm getting from you, and I want you to just briefly talk about this, is the importance of the dad, because usually it goes to the mom. Usually they get custody. The importance of the dad, even though they've moved into a different direction in their life, the importance of staying in touch and close with their kids as much as they can.
Right.
If
And
the ex-wife,
sometimes
if the ex-wife will allow it.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes before I answer that, Doug, I just have to give you a little anecdote that I think reflects what you're saying so much. And again, I'm a boomer, so I'm a child of the 60s. And the first time I realized that I wasn't the only person in the world that didn't have a dad, I was about 10. And, during that, and part of that was teasing and bullying about the fact that I didn't have a dad. Okay. So fast forward now to I'm working in my practicums to get my master's degree. And I worked in all the different schools. I worked in elementary schools and all the different levels of schools. And I was doing this group for 10-year-olds. And there was one kid that was getting really picked on or teased by the group. And it was because he was the only person in the group that had two parents living at home.
Wow.
So the juxtaposition, again,
Yeah.
as you just said, the prevalence of divorce, the changes, the absence of the fathers, all of that is so tied together. Even dealing again with the kids, the kids in the boot camp were many of them were 17, 18 and already had children, and were trying to do what they could to be able to support the baby mama and to support the baby. And sometimes that's what got him in trouble, because they could go work at McDonald's for $7 an hour, or they could sling crack for, $200 a day. Right.
Yeah.
And that was part of the conflict. So, the absence of a male role model, is so prevalent in our culture, and it creates so many challenges because men don't know how to perform.
Well,
They don't learn, or they learn by watching John Wayne or John Wick.
Yeah.
Right?
And so dads, if you're divorced and your children are with your ex, for heaven's sakes, stay close to them. Do whatever it takes, if possible, to get that communication open, because it makes a difference, as you say.
Yeah. They're going to recognize whether you're there or not. They're going to know that, and it's going to impact them. And this isn't about guilting dads, because dads are doing the best they can with the resources that they have. Right.
Exactly. So as we close, and again, it just amazes me how fast time goes by. And this has been just an incredible conversation. I appreciate it. But how do people find you?
Yeah. So, like I said, I had a pretty long business career, so I hang out on LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Mark Wigginton. I also have a website. It's focusingonresults.com. And from there, you can subscribe to my newsletter. I write a newsletter that comes out every other Tuesday, it's called Your Next Chapter. So it's focusing on midlife transition, the kind of things that we talked about, and other issues that are related to midlife change. Those are the best ways to find me. And I'd love to have your audience subscribe.
Oh, wonderful. And so as we close, what would be that final thought, that final message you'd want to share with the audience?
Well, I think there are really two pieces to it. One is talking back about my relationship with my father and that evolution. And, it might not have been the relationship that either one of us really wanted, but it was the relationship that we had, and it was the relationship that we made work. And back to your point about the importance of connecting. And I think that tied to the message of, understanding that you don't have to fix everything. You just have to open a door. And really kind of the bottom line being, every day you have the chance to start again.
Okay.
No matter how old you are, every day you have a chance to start again.
Oh, that's wonderful. Mark, thanks so much. Number one, I appreciate you reaching out to me like you did on LinkedIn. And it's rare that someone does that on LinkedIn. So I appreciate that. And, quite frankly, your story and what you're doing now, I think, is making such a difference for the people you work with. So I want to just applaud you for that.
Well, thank you. And I will say, Doug, that there are so few mental health focused or transformation focused podcasts. You're making a really impact by your message as well. I mean, it's important to let people know that it's okay to talk about this stuff, and you do that.
Well, thank you. And folks, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. Be sure to reach out to Mark. I think that you're going to find some really interesting stuff, particularly the newsletter, I think is great. So thanks for listening. Hope you'll join us again soon. This is Dr. Doug, as usual, saying namaste.